I will hand it over to you guys.
Excellent. So you're stuck with me and Ken again, but the real brains have joined the stage here. I'll let them just give a bit more background because I think just like the last panel, like this is stacked. So, Jake, you want to go?
Hey, Jake Langenkamp, spent 20 years in the DoD. I was active duty Marine and then a civilian for the DoD. Went all over the world, Central Asia, Middle East, and then finished up in Africa, which led to my now current vocation of, along with a couple of other former national security practitioners, one from the State Department, one from the DoD, trying to get Bitcoin mining going in the developing world, specifically Africa.
Excellent. Kyle?
Yeah, hi, my name's Kyle Schneps, VP of Policy at Foundry. My background is most of my career as a U.S. intelligence officer, working both at home and abroad, and also spent a year as a diplomat at the State Department.
Excellent. So this is a good segue from the last panel, which I think was a bit tactical, illicit finance, kind of very much the front of mind policy question that's addressed on the minds of policymakers in DC. I think we want to step back a bit, Bitcoin and geopolitics, and importantly center on Bitcoin specifically, as opposed to the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem we were looking at in the last panel, as well as more geopolitics, which encompasses national security, but is a bit of a broader conceptual framework. And I want to kind of pose kind of a challenge to policymakers, sort of open the aperture away explicitly from illicit finance as being the sole lens by which we look at national security implications of Bitcoin specifically, and really broaden the view to think about what could be plausible scenarios the next 4 to 8 years, which a presidential term coming up could face sort of novel questions that I'm not sure are being addressed. And so I want to sort of put some of those questions on the table. And Bitcoin is potentially poised to span many different policy and kind of technical domains that are currently kind of very siloed in our current approach to statecraft, whether it's international relations, monetary policy, finance, illicit finance, and sort of emerging technology. Sort of is all bundled together in this emerging complicated network and its sort of rapid adoption around the world, sort of stressing and straining different policy domains. So I kind of want to set the table there. But seeing we have a very international perspective from the audience on this group, and geopolitics is about beyond our shores. It's about the relations between states, non-state actors, the unfolding dynamics in the global system, changes of power, and money is very closely tied to power. So changes to the nature of money, I think, inevitably lead to changes to the structures of power. So with that, kind of, I want to get at like a status quo assessment. Maybe we'll start with Jake in terms of your travels around the world, going to the Middle East, going to Africa, having conversations with people on the ground. What would you say is like the status quo of how other countries, especially important kind of balancing powers or sort of emerging markets, are positioning to Bitcoin at like a state level?
Yeah, so I just came back from Africa a few weeks ago, specifically having conversations about Bitcoin mining. So there was a lot of conversation around the topic, both at the individual level, but then also the state level. And I think what you're clearly seeing is state actors are starting to realize that the technology to take trapped extant energy, which is a liability for them, and turn it into like a huge, and not only way to drive foreign direct investment and revenue, but also a way to get their hands on dollars, which is, kind of underserved part of that conversation. That's a big driver of it. And you're starting to see it kind of, not necessarily in blocks or alliances, but, countries that have close relationships with each other. So an example of that is, I think everybody here is probably tracking that the UAE jumped into the deep end with Bitcoin mining and what they're doing with Marathon and stuff like that. I don't think that it's coincidence that they have such a close relationship with Ethiopia. Ethiopia also just jumped into the deep end and allowed a couple dozen Bitcoin mining companies into the country. They joined BRICS together, those two countries. The UAE has provided quite a lot of dollar liquidity to the Ethiopian central bank because they were having a dollar shortage. So I think you're going to start seeing those kind of connectivity between friendly nations, client state, or the like that.
And I want to come back to this later, but since you brought it up, I want to just do a quick follow-up question, which is, where's the battleground in terms of U.S. strategic influence as a particular case study? So are we in a position where we can leverage Bitcoin to get our foot in the door and have influence and have interests on the ground, or are our adversaries there first, or are they winning?
So it's a complicated question because obviously in most of these developing countries, you see way more Chinese companies, sometimes even Russian companies than American companies. That's starting to change though, and the American companies that are going into these markets are U.S. public listed companies. So that's quite a interconnectivity between the U.S. government and some of these state levels. I was talking to somebody earlier, they're saying, from one of these companies that they're going to have a head of state visit on one of their upcoming trips within an African nation. And what I've found in my recent travels to Africa and talking to some of these government institutions is that they're very much leaning on the U.S. They're in terms of being in pole position for the partners that they want to work with, because they're asking us, hey, how should we think about this from a regulatory standpoint? We've heard that there's ways of doing grid stabilization and demand response. Can you share information about that? And we know that those are not questions that they're asking Chinese companies, Russian companies that are coming to do Bitcoin mining there. So I think as you look at the digital yuan and what China's trying to do on that front, nobody owns Bitcoin, but it might be better to have a neutral reserve asset than a foreign directed reserve asset.
Excellent. So, Kyle, I think you were also recently coming back from the region as well. Could you give us your perspective, your readout, and kind of conversations, and kind of how that part of the world is thinking about Bitcoin?
Yeah. So I just did a few speaking engagements in UAE and also in Oman. And I think there's, from the various travels I've done and looking back and forward, I see a general bifurcation developing in terms of how nations are approaching energy. And so on the one hand, we have a holistic approach to energy, like we're seeing in some of these Arabian Peninsula countries, and that is they're investing in a wide variety of different forms of energy production. And then on the other hand, we see this exclusionary approach to energy, and that's mostly being embraced in Western Europe and North America. One of the takeaways from the GCC countries is that they are looking ahead to where technology is going to flourish, and they've understood, I think like many of us have, that the future is going to be in energy production and its ability to feed data centers. And whether we're talking about Bitcoin mining or AI or data storage, whatever it is, things that we haven't even developed yet, it's going to be in energy and the ability to process and compute. And so they are getting a head start by even not only embracing their natural gifts in terms of fossil fuels, but investing in nuclear, solar, all different things. Whereas we've seen sometimes in Western nations this applying this moralistic lens to energy that may kind of get in our own way at some point in the future as we hope to achieve some sort of technological strategic advantage.
So you have several sort of Gulf kingdoms with a lot of money tied up in sovereign wealth funds that are sort of led and directed, steered by a handful of elite figures that can set a strategic direction, and can resource it, can execute it, and are now putting those plans into action. I guess, Ken, from your perspective, both in your former IC land and then now in kind of the private sector with kind of a global view, how do you think the United States should think about those dynamics? Like, where do we need to engage? How do we need to understand where this is going to head in 3, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, just first a quick observation just about the conference. It's not necessarily the number of attendees, which is impressive, but honestly, it's the breadth of agencies represented today is really impressive. And I think that's a reflection of a realization that Bitcoin is here to stay, and it's not just because of ETFs and BlackRock, but for a lot of reasons. So I think it's great. I think it's very important. It shows me that at different levels that the government is starting to think about this as what I think is I'll be a little wistful here, an emerging reserve asset. So I think it's job of policymakers to respond to things, but also to think through. And I think we need to start considering a world, again, wistfully, in which Bitcoin emerges as a reserve asset that is separate but adjacent to the financial system, a reserve asset that does not rely on intermediaries, and a reserve asset that I think is frankly resistance money, right? It is the antidote to digital authoritarianism. And I know that the idea of another reserve asset emerging somehow that represents competition for the dollar. I don't think that's the case. I am not a dollar doomer at all. And I think that the way I envision it is what happens if Bitcoin takes 30, 50% of the gold, of the global value of gold. What's that, 16 trillion? What are the implications for U.S. policy? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that too, and so I'll take off my moderator hat for 2 seconds and just put on my my soapbox, which is so this whoever is the next president for the next 4 years, I would say there's a reasonable probability. Wouldn't say it's likely, but there's a decent chance that Bitcoin could monetize to some meaningful fraction of gold during the next president's term. I am not aware of any policy memo or debate or even just glimmer of a discussion about what would be the policy options, what would be the strategic posture from the United States officially to that type of scenario. Have we thought about the effects on the Treasury security? Have we thought about the effects on, okay, if this is monetizing, who are the people that are gaining that monetization? Is it Emirati oligarchs? Is it folks in Singapore? Capital flight out of China? Is it American companies and American citizens, individuals? Is it sort of a distributed airdrop on emerging markets in Africa, et cetera? If that were to take place, if there was going to be this monetization that occurs, there could be many different types of geopolitical and international spillovers. I'm not seeing that conversation, right? And so I'm not seeing just the basic question being posed in terms of that what if. And I think hopefully we can pose that question. And I'm not saying there are easy answers for that question, but I think it's a serious question that needs to be posed. And I think we were talking about this earlier. It's not like there's anyone around that has a master plan or that has a grand strategy. Everyone thinks there's someone that's cooking up the secret sauce for the next 5 or 10 years. And even the folks in the Middle East, the folks at the helm of these $1 trillion sovereign wealth funds, they don't necessarily know exactly what they're getting into, right? Kyle, maybe you can elaborate on that. Just because they have a lot of money and they can move fast doesn't mean they actually are seeing multiple steps ahead. And so that, I think, gives an advantage to anyone that even tries to think a few steps ahead. I guess, Kyle, from your perspective, and then go back to Jake, in terms of, what are you seeing in terms of the manifestation of that, and then the room for, smart, intentional, strategic policy? Yeah,
well, one advantage that does not, that sort of monarchical structure gives you is that you can try to plan long term. You can have a plan and try to affect it over 20, 30, or 40 years. Obviously, with what many of us believe here in the U.S., it's not a trade-off we would like to make. But being in the system that we're in, we generally operate in 2 and 4 year cycles of what is going to be a favored policy versus maybe something that's antithetical to whatever administration is in place. And so when you have that limit or that short-sightedness, sometimes it prevents having those long-term strategies. But I would certainly agree there is no master plan over a long period of time. The government is mostly reactionary, but that does provide us opportunities, I would hope, to educate some of those people so that when they are usually making some sort of gut reaction to geopolitical events or to something like Bitcoin, which I think has a very long-term time horizon on its influence in the world, I think that if they are educated to a certain degree, they may be able to fall back on that to help inform potentially better decisions in the future.
Jake, I want to turn to you in terms of what sorts of voices have not typically been involved in the policy process from kind of national security community on this exact question. The last panel we were on is obviously illicit finance. I think there's no shortage of people willing to jump into the waters from, say, Treasury, from state, from other folks that have in equities and sort of sanctions, illicit finance, law enforcement investigations. But there's sort of a dark matter in the national security community that's focused on great power competition, that's focused on the next 5, 10, 20 years, and what are the major changes that are going to unfold across technology, monetary, sort of geopolitical structures, and their job is to make sure U.S. comes out on top, or at least doesn't lose. And so what do you think about whose voice needs to be brought in that otherwise historically or culturally they haven't been bringing their voice into the room?
Yeah, so we were having a conversation about this earlier, just after lunch, and the roundtable discussion very much focused on, enforcement, illicit finance, like you were saying, but then also advocacy domestically. Hey, talk to your congressman, talk to your senators, things like that. There's very powerful organs of the U.S. government that have a completely neutral, i.e., we don't care at all, stance on Bitcoin. I think the national security apparatus largely falls under that. However, there are some major implications of things that are happening in this space. For instance, like I talked about earlier, I know that the national security apparatus has, burned some calories and put some thought process towards the digital yuan and what this means potentially spread across like Belt and Road countries. That's a part of the conversation where you can say, okay, if the preeminence of the dollar, while still very dominant, if you put it on a chart, it's declining, not increasing. What do you want to take its place? Do you want an adversarial currency, controlled by a closed loop economy, or do you want a neutral reserve asset? So that's one conversation. I think also as more and more of these countries figure out, that they can monetize extant energy and turn a liability into a benefit, the people that are going to be at the table for those conversations are going to have quite a bit of newfound influence in countries, throughout the Middle East and countries in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, India, all these places. And a lot of those countries are across, BRICS, or, that's the geopolitical gray space that the national security apparatus is mainly focused on. And, obviously, the great power competition gets brought up. Everybody focuses on Russia, everybody focuses on China, but from my experience, and I would love to hear y'all's opinion, usually it's the geopolitical gray space of Latin America, the Middle East, Africa. That's where, that kind of, soft power, Cold War kind of influence gets wielded. And those are the places that are going to be the places where Bitcoin finds true adoption, and where a lot of these countries are starting to look at a nation state level, sovereign wealth fund or things like that starting to mine Bitcoin.
Kyle, you want to pick up the thread? Because I think I've heard you speak on very similar issues.
Yeah, I certainly, if you pick up any Cold War spy book, all the actions happening in the sandboxes of the places that Jake just mentioned, that's where a lot of the action is actually taking place, and that's where a lot of the governments are investing their resources. I will say, I just want to piggyback on something Jake said, and this is something Matt and I have talked about many times, but regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative, they have spent decades now building the veins and arteries that they need around the world. And the digital yuan is now the lifeblood that will be injected into that system to provide a lot of the advantages they need geopolitically for various surveillance types of operations. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity here for the U.S. government. It is not going to be by building veins and arteries, through physical infrastructure like China has done, because they're so far ahead. What our opportunity is that there is already the largest global computer network in the world that you can transfer value on for virtually nothing, and that's a Bitcoin network. And so by adopting that network, by promoting it, you are promoting a wide variety of democratic ideals and an alternative system of finance to parts of the world that may have to contend with a digital yuan.
Yeah, no, Ken, you picked up on this earlier, but I want to hit it harder in terms of this competition. In Cold War terms, sometimes it can be seen as zero sum, realist. It's all just hard power. We're just trying to influence kind of folks that are in the balancing states. But I think there's also a moral, kind of ethical, political dimension here, which is a competition over systems of governance, right? That China's vision and that they're exporting and having, there's willing buyers is a sort of techno-authoritarianism, digital surveillance, sort of digital authoritarianism as a service kind of stack from sort of the cloud infrastructure, the basic telecommunications, information communications technology, all the way up to the digital currency systems that are empowering autocratically inclined or totalitarian dictators. to sort of keep them sort of on the platform that China is trying to get subscribers to, and at the same time, pull billions of people kind of under their yoke. So there's a lot of stakes at sort of who wins this emerging sort of techno-authoritarianism versus what we would call, a sort of liberal digital freedom oriented model. And so to that end, are we gonna win that fight by sort of competing with our own CBDC? Are we gonna win by just trying to out-totalitarianize the Chinese? Sort of what is the alternative to win in that fight on a principles basis? So what about Bitcoin as an open system kind of offers that as sort of almost an endogenous capability that doesn't require the U.S. government to direct it? It's just going to happen as long as we support it.
Yeah, so as Kyle referenced before, we don't plan very well, and we're not going to outplan China, right? They have a system of government that is built to plan. I think that at least throughout the 20th century, the United States had two currencies, right? It was the dollar, and it was a set of ideals. And after the post-war world, that set of ideals served us very well. Individual rights, democracy, it served us very well. It was not always in completely equal ascendance, but nonetheless, I think generally speaking, there's consensus that the post-war world was successful because we were able to export those ideals. And I think as we look at where competition, specifically China, is going to happen, you look at like the Vietnams of the world, India, Thailand, Indonesia, maybe even Turkey. But these are the countries with the highest level of cryptocurrency adoption, among that Bitcoin. And one thing that Chinese have taught us is that we can't simply, there can't just be, we can't just export lessons. We have to export something. We have to encourage interaction on some level, not just with not just with platitudes and education about different things. And I think that if we are going to successfully compete, and these countries that I mentioned, they need to interact, they need to live with China, they want to trade with China, they need to interact with China, they're in China's neighborhood, as do we, by the way. We don't necessarily have to be antagonistic with China at all. But these countries will be looking for alternatives to the digital yuan, right? Is the future of their banking system the cross-border international payment system that China has deployed around the world? I don't think so. It's certainly not in our interest if that's the case. And we also have to recognize that these countries will also look to have some sort of economic reserves that aren't dollar-based for a lot of reasons. Some of the discussion about the dollar is unsatisfying. There's a lot of discussion about numbers. But ultimately, if you're a sovereign country, you need to have some kind of wealth that's not subject to the whims of another sovereign, or even if that sovereign's your best friend. And I think that where we have fertile ground, Bitcoin is potentially a mechanism for building better ties in that periphery.
And this might be a bit technical and historical, but I think policymakers need to look back at the 20th century, and particularly the emergence of the eurodollar market. I don't want to be too technical, but how did the dollar become the global reserve currency? How did the U.S. Treasury become the global reserve asset, which are sort of the foundations of how much like our geoeconomic sort of hegemonic power has been based for the past 75 years? And part of it was policy driven, but part of it was sort of benign neglect of a global system that just wanted to find a solution to a certain pattern of commercial problems, and they settled on the dollar. And there's something called Regulation Q, which basically capped interest rates in the United States and basically allowed sort of this market to flourish for dollars overseas, so that any bank or sort of bank-like entity could essentially issue dollar liabilities, sort of stand-up operations, start doing lending and commercial finance in dollars, and sort of just like sprouted this organic dollar ecosystem that was progressively formalized through networks of hierarchical correspondent banking relationships that now, like in the last 20 years, U.S. government has been effectively able to sort of exert power through extraterritorial imposition of our sanctions regime. But it wasn't built, with that in mind. It sort of happened organically. And if we had, heavily controlled and were terrified about bad guys using these sort of offshore balance sheets to do bad things, the eurodollar wouldn't have ever grown to what it became. And so I think about this analogy with stable coins now, this tension between, yes, bad guys are using it, but at the same time, as we heard, I think a Fed president just the other day basically say, the proliferation of dollar-based stablecoins is sort of a net good for the U.S. in the sense that these are now dollar liabilities that are proliferating in a world that creates a structural demand for more dollar assets, especially our sovereign debt. And where we're looking for more buyers of sovereign debt, if the Chinese aren't going to buy a whole lot more, if the Japanese are eventually going to be tapped out, if we're now sanctioning Russian treasury securities, and maybe the folks in the Middle East are a little bit skittish about holding too much of their marginal surpluses and reserves, we're going to need more sources of structural treasury demand, essentially demand for our debt. So I think we need to connect these different domains. And if we're thinking about this break glass scenario where, if we do get to a breakdown in geopolitical relations, which hopefully we don't, but there is an acute monetary dimension to this that I think, Jake, you were pointing at, which is, there's a competition over networks. China has a strategy to essentially enlist wide swaths of the global south, as well as the main commodity producing countries in the world, into its geoeconomic orbit, and use essentially digital rails to connect them into its sphere of digital influence, and then export kind of a techno governance model on top. And if they're successful, that will structurally weaken the foundations upon which U.S. sort of monetary dominance was premised. And our plan A seems to have been just double down on the treasury market, try to keep it stable as much as possible, whether it's bailouts or swap lines or repo facilities or financial repression, force banks and other institutions to hold more capital, give them sort of essentially inducements to just stuff more treasuries into the balance sheets. It's like a short-term strategy. As our debt kind of continues to climb exponentially, that's our plan. I don't see much of a plan B. And if plan B for adversaries that they're trying to address is essentially undermine the treasury market, make it a source of vulnerability, increasingly fragile for us, and then they're acquiring gold. And so they might return towards a 19th century style economic system, a 19th century geopolitical orientation, as we've seen in Eastern Europe. So that is a bad plan from our perspective. And so I think, hypothetically, it sounds fanciful 2 years ago, but I think it's increasingly less fanciful to think about the monetization of Bitcoin as a neutral reserve asset that, again, to the extent that it relatively absorbs more of what the adversaries in Eurasia want to push into gold, it benefits us, as we are the dominant holders of Bitcoin. We have the most Bitcoin companies. If we have a positive regulatory environment, then those advantages, that sort of plan B, is in our favor. Jake, I know we've talked about this, so your thoughts.
Yeah, so I wanted to hit on a couple things that Ken said. China is much better at planning than us, but they took themselves out of the Bitcoin game. They officially banned it after all the jokes about, yep, China banned Bitcoin again. They actually really did it, and that's what allowed us to capture the majority of the Bitcoin mining. And the other thing that he mentioned that stuck out is that, sovereigns don't want to hold their, wealth in an asset that another sovereign, controls. So I think that means that they're not necessarily going to run from the dollar to the yuan. And I think that's why you see the increase in central banks holding gold. And I think, we sometimes don't give the developing world enough credit, where if they have time to wrap their head around it, they're usually much faster at doing so. And I think that they're going to say, once they really take a look underneath the hood of Bitcoin and be like, okay, so no one actually controls this, but I can use it as a neutral reserve asset. Because, right now, if Ethiopia wants to sell electricity to Kenya, that transaction has to go from shillings to dollars to Ethiopian birr. And that's what has always kept Africa back from being able to do intercontinent trade there. So I think those ideals will shine through for them faster than they will for us.
Excellent. Well, I want to say thank you to my fellow panelists, and best of luck for the rest of the day.